Okay. Welcome back, everyone. All right. We're all still here and breathing. We're all gonna continue learning about breathing. That's real loud. Okay. So we're gonna continue thinking about pulmonary ventilation. So last time we talked about the pressures involved in ventilation. So we talked about how we are comparing atmospheric pressure that we set to 0 to our alveolar pressure, so the pressure in the alveoli. And when our pressure in the alveoli is greater than the pressure in the environment around us, that means we have a pressure gradient. So air moves out of the alveoli, out to the atmosphere. And when we have a low pressure in the alveoli, lower than our atmosphere, again, we have a gradient. So air is going to move from the atmosphere into your lungs, into those alveoli. We also talked about a couple other pressures, particularly our intrapleural pressure. So in the sac around the lungs, we got some fluid. We got a negative pressure there in that sac. It's kind of pulling on the lung tissue, sticking it to the chest wall. And we can measure that also by calculating our transpulmonary pressure. So giving us the exact pressure across the wall of the lung as a difference between the alveolar pressure in the alveoli and the intrapleural pressure in that intrapleural space. So now we're going to think about the muscles that mechanically help us change these pressures. Okay, so we have some muscles that are going to help us when we breathe in. We're going to have some muscles that help us sometimes when we breathe out. Okay, so our inspiratory muscles, inspiration, breathing in, what they're trying to do, right? We're trying to drop down the alveolar pressure. We're trying to drop down that pressure in the lung so that we have a gradient for air to move into the lung. Okay. So the way we do that is by changing the volume of our thorax, changing how much space we have in the chest, and therefore also changing the pressure of the thoracic cavity. So we also talked about that relationship between pressure and volume when we looked at the ideal gas law and looked at Boyle's law. But fundamentally, what we need to remember about that is that when we have a big container, that means we have a low pressure. When we have a small container, that means we have a high pressure. So what we're doing with our inspiratory muscles is we are trying to make the volume of your chest larger. Okay. So we have muscles that do that. I'm gonna just draw a kind of circle as your chest. Actually, I'm gonna draw a square. Sorry, guys. Okay, we're gonna have a big square rectangle, and we have a division between our thorax and our abdomen, which I'll put on bottom. Okay, that division is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a large flat sheet of muscle. Be very easy to see it in a lab. It's kind of cutting you in half. Okay. What you want to remember about the diaphragm and about muscles in general, when they contract, they get shorter. Okay. So in its relaxed state, we've got a long diaphragm. It's going to look like this. It's going to be arched up and over, right? So this is before you breathe in. When you want to breathe in, when you want to inspire, when you want to inhale, we're going to contract the diaphragm, right? Contract it, make it shorter, which means it's going to flatten out. So we've just made this thorax bigger, right? So here's our thorax. All right. So that is the most important of the muscles controlling your breathing. So first muscle to remember is the diaphragm. Remember, when it contracts and gets shorter, flattens out, makes your chest bigger. Okay. So that rise in the volume of the thoracic cavity means we have a drop in the pressure there in the thoracic cavity, meaning we can pull air in. So it's kind of sucking air in for you. You do also have muscles attaching all your ribs to each other. So those are called your intercostals. Inter, between, costa are ribs, so between the ribs. you've got layers of these muscles, and different layers do different things. The ones on the outside basically pull the ribs up and out, right? So we can make the thorax bigger by making that space longer with the diaphragm, right? That's one way we can make it bigger. The other way we can make it bigger is by making it kind of bigger anteroposteriorly, right? Like forward and also kind of to the side. So you can put your hands on your chest and feel that too, right? As you breathe in, you can feel how your chest rises, right? So that's your external intercostals, pulling those ribs up and out. So we mainly actually use muscles for breathing in, okay? So inspiration, making that thoracic cavity bigger, is usually the thing that's going to take force. We do have muscles that can help you expire, that can raise the pressure, that can, I don't know, allow you to breathe out forcefully. Usually it's kind of a passive process, but we're going to mention the muscles that would help it. When you think about expiration and muscles, I want you to think about going like, right? Like puffing breath out forcefully. That's you using your muscles. Usually you don't have to do that if you're not like being really forceful about it. But the muscles you would use if you're trying to forcefully breathe out are another layer of intercostals. So the external ones are on the outside. They pull your ribs up and out. Internal intercostals have fibers that go the opposite direction. So they pull your ribs down and in, right? So that collapses your chest if you activate those. The other thing that you can do is activate your abdominal muscles, right? So if you breathe out hard, you can feel your abdomen tense, right? So those abdominal muscles are basically squishing the organs in your abdomen up into your thoracic cavity a little bit. And that's how they're helping you decrease the volume of the thorax and therefore increase its pressure so you can forcefully get air out of your lungs. I'll take a look at them in a drawing here. So this is what they look like, slightly realer life, and you'll see the most real life in lab. Okay, but we can see our muscles for inspiration on the left-hand side here. All right, so inspiration, breathing in, we're trying to make the thoracic cavity bigger. So here we can see this diaphragm at rest, its curviness, right? So when we contract it, it's going to move down, give us a larger space for our lungs, help us breathe in. And here are those external intercostals, and there's their fiber direction. All right, so you're going to think about them pulling this rib below, up and out, kind of swinging it out so your chest gets wider in a lot of different directions as it does that. For expiration, if you're doing it forcefully, here are the muscles you're using. Those internal intercostals, you can see how they're going the opposite direction. So they have the opposite action to the external intercostals. So instead of pulling your chest up and out, they're going to collapse it in, pull those ribs down and in. And here we see those abdominal muscles. So we're going to squish everything, give everything less space, give your abdominal organs less space. So they have to push into the thorax a bit. And you can see that they are also actually attached to some degree to our rib cage. So they're also kind of pushing on it that way. So we're making a big chest to make a low pressure pull air in. We make a small chest to make a high pressure push air out. And we're just doing that by moving the bones, by moving the muscles, and this is going to change our pressures. So it's going to change our intrapleural pressure, our transpulmonary pressure, our alveolar pressure. Ultimately, what we care about is that change in the alveolar pressure that either draws air in or pushes air out. Okay. So if we're thinking about the order of events that happens as you breathe in, as you inspire, as you inhale, as you do this first part of the breath cycle, this first part of pulmonary ventilation, you're going to want a nerve, right? You're going to send a nerve to first the diaphragm, most importantly, right? So we know as a muscle, it's a skeletal muscle because it has a name. You can think about it. You can move it if you want, right? You can actively think about your diaphragm, although you don't usually, okay? So we're going to have those somatic nerves that we talked about in A&P 1. Diaphragm contracts, meaning its fibers get shorter, which means it goes down, right? So it flattens, it moves downward. Okay? And at the same time, we have a little bit of rotation happening in the ribs, pulling them up and out, widening the thorax. Okay? So we've got this kind of pivot, and you can feel it when you touch your chest, and it's because of the external intercostals. They're the ones just kind of sitting on top. Okay. So we've expanded the thorax in multiple directions. We've both expanded it supero-inferiorly, up and down. We've expanded it antero-posteriorly and even a little bit mediolaterally, all the directions. We expanded it everywhere, okay? This means we are pulling on stuff, okay? So as we change the size of that cavity, we know that we have an intrapleural space between the lung tissue and the chest wall, right? So we have a visceral pleura touching the lung, a parietal pleura on the inner part of the chest wall, and we have a little bit of intrapleural fluid, a little bit of liquid in there, sticking them together. Okay. So as our chest expands, okay, this is going to create a drop in that intrapleural pressure, that PIP, okay, as that chest wall is moving away from the lung, or kind of creating a negative pressure, kind of creating a vacuum in this space, you can think of it. Okay, so I have this dropping intrapleural pressure, and our transpulmonary pressure is across the wall of the lung specifically. So I'm going to make sure that we're all having the same mental image of this space while I'm saying these words. Okay. Okay. So here is our lung. Okay. We're going to have a sac around it. I'll just do this one on the right. All right. So this sac is fully enclosed. One side is on the viscous, actually just means an organ. That's why it's visceral pleura. Parietal just means wall. Okay, so some on the organ, some on the wall, but we've got this space here. So this is our intrapleural space and our intrapleural fluid. Okay, so when we moved the chest wall out, using those external intercostals, making this space larger, all right, we're creating the vacuum, the negative pressure here in that sac, in that intrapleural space, where we're holding things together with the surface tension of our intrapleural fluid. Okay. So this is what's going down, that part in this blue region. And the transpulmonary pressure, we're measuring across the wall of the lung. So in the lung, we had our alveolar pressure. Okay. That's where our alveolar pressure was. Here's where our intrapleural pressure was. So the transpulmonary pressure is just comparing the pressure inside the lung to that pressure in the space around it. That transpulmonary pressure, when we have one, when it gets bigger, that means we have more of a pull, basically, for the lung to distend. So as that vacuum suction kind of happens in the intrapleural space, we're creating more of a pull on the lung for it to expand as we increase that transpulmonary pressure. Okay. So this means that we're now expanding each of those little alveoli in the lung. So each of those little clusters where we have our actual gas exchange happen, that is getting pulled open as we pull open the lung. Okay? And when we pull something open, when we make it larger, we've got a pressure drop. So that happens in the alveoli. And we finally have a difference between the alveoli, so that PALV, which we compare to our atmospheric pressure. Okay. We always do these as relative pressures, so we set atmospheric pressure always to 0. Right? So when we drop this PALV down, we're going to get some kind of negative number. Right? So we now have a gradient. Right? So this is why we go from a higher atmospheric pressure towards that negative pressure in the lung, going in by bulk flow. So if we wanted to do it in equations, I'm just trying to give you like 12 ways to try and get this to click. Once it clicks, doesn't really matter which part of this clicked for you, just so you know. So this flow part, bulk flow, is always a difference in pressure, right, divided by resistance. So in this case, that difference in pressure we're thinking about is the difference between that atmospheric pressure and that alveolar pressure, right? So we have a difference here. Questions about this process? Okay. I'm pretty sure I'm about to say it again in another form. Okay. Yep. Okay. So we got it in flowchart form as well. Okay. So we're thinking our motor neurons, those somatic motor neurons, are our neural input telling us we want to breathe in, right? We need to know that we want to breathe in. Okay. So our brain has to tell our nerves that have to tell our muscles. Okay. Then our inspiratory muscles need to get the memo. Okay. So we send out these nervous impulses. There's acetylcholine binding to receptors, et cetera, makes the muscle contract. All those sarcomeres doing their cross-bridge cycles, muscle gets shorter. Okay. So muscles are contracting, they're getting shorter, which means our chest wall is expanding, right? So ribs are going up and out, sternum is going up and out because of those external intercostals. Diaphragm is going down, expanding the thorax from below, which means that we are now pulling on that intrapleural space that's filled with intrapleural fluid, right? So this is creating a pull. The pull means a negative pressure, right? So pull here is the negative pressure, which means we have a bigger difference between the intrapleural pressure, that intrapleural space, and the pressure inside the lung in the alveoli. So we could calculate a transpulmonary pressure at this point, and it would have gone up. And that's an expression of this force that's pulling the alveoli open. So at this point, the alveoli expand, their volume goes up, which means their pressure is going to go down. Cool. So now our alveolar pressure is going down, which means we have a bigger difference between the atmospheric pressure and the alveolar pressure. And the direction of that gradient is such that we have air moving from the atmosphere into the lung, into the alveoli. So overall, we have flow into the alveoli until we have so much air rushing into the alveoli that we start upping the pressure again, right? So this inverse relationship between pressure and volume is true for a constant amount of gas. But if you start filling that big container with a lot of stuff, eventually you raise the pressure back up. And that's why you stop breathing at a certain point, right? Like you breathe in and then you can't breathe in anymore, right? That's when you've gotten to that equilibrium pressure because you pulled in more gas. Okay. So overall, that's our workflow here. We could look at this also on a graph, charting all these pressures happening across a timeline. So here we're looking at inspiration and expiration. We've got a little line here for our alveolar pressure, right? That's this one up top. Typically, alveolar pressure shouldn't be changing that much. We'll talk about why and how and why that might be different a little bit later on. But typically, this top line, this alveolar pressure, it's just dipping between -1 and +1. We don't need a huge difference with the atmosphere in order to breathe, which is great because that means our muscles don't have to work so hard. Okay. So we've got this alveolar pressure here, and we can see what's going on with that intrapleural pressure as well. So as you're pulling the chest open, pulling on that intrapleural fluid, you can see that negative pressure in the intrapleural space dropping and dropping. That's our kind of vacuum action. And you can see how we created a transpulmonary pressure that's getting larger the whole time that you're breathing in. Okay. And then as you relax, you're going to expire. So you're going to exhale, you're going to breathe out, right? So we had this point where our alveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure reached equilibrium, right? They're both zero. Okay. And that is the lowest point as well for our intrapleural pressure, right? So then your muscles relax, your chest starts moving back in. So this intrapleural pressure is still negative, still sticking stuff together, but it's going up, right? Which means we're squishing down our alveoli, we're compressing them, we're making them smaller. So their pressure is going up, which means you're breathing out. Okay. So this is overall how we're creating the forces that allow you to pull air in. So increasing your breath volume, increasing how much air is inside your lung, and then pushing it out for the second half. That was just a reiteration in different forms with different pictures. Did that raise any new questions for people at this point? Okay, cool. Okay. So this is your reminder in the form of bullet points that when you're breathing out, you usually don't have to force it, right? Like you take a big gulp of air in, but then you just let go to breathe out, okay? So usually expiration, usually breathing out is a passive process. If you're having to force air out hard, maybe you're having an asthma attack, maybe you're coughing, but something is usually going on that means that you need more pressure than usual, okay? So usually expiration is a passive process. So usually the chest wall and the lungs are just recoiling back to their original positions. So the inspiration, the breathing in, is the one that takes energy, basically. Yeah. Now that's the case for normal breaths, which we will learn when we talk about volumes and capacities, are going to be referred to as tidal breaths. So that's your teaser for that. Tidal breaths are just easy in and out. We're not really thinking about them. Active expiration, if someone tells you to breathe out as hard as you can to get all the air out of your lungs, that you would use some muscles for, specifically those internal intercostals and the abdominal muscles. And that's going to push more force faster, helping you to breathe out harder. Okay. So we're going to think now about some factors that can change stuff up a little bit, make it easier to breathe, make it harder to breathe, create problems. Okay. All right. So in order to do this, we want to remember about compliance and resistance. So we talked about compliance and resistance when we were talking about the blood, and they are coming back in a big way now. So when we think about compliance and resistance here, we're going to be thinking largely about the lungs when we're thinking about compliance. So the like tissue of the lung, which if you go poke them, it's going to be kind of spongy. Some cool texture. I recommend poking lungs. Okay. And we're going to be thinking about resistance when we think about tubes. So when we think about resistance, we're largely going to be thinking about airways. So the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, when we think about resistance. Yep. So I am going to ask you to remind me what it means if I tell you something is highly compliant. Okay, so what does highly compliant mean? Well, let's take a look. Okay, am I still going up? Okay. Okay. So high compliance, when we talked about it before, we were talking about veins. We're talking about how veins hold a lot of volume. They're volume reservoirs because they're big and floppy, right? I do keep asking you about compliance because the first 5 times I learned compliance, I hated it. So I'm walking you through how I like to think about it. All right, so compliance is about a relationship between pressure and volume. I like to remember our veins and our arteries because it's easy for me to remember a big blue line on top for our veins and a lower red line on bottom for our arteries. So high compliance in the veins, low compliance in the arteries. And so how we are reading this, right? So we're talking about volume here, right? So when we think about high compliance, when we think about this high line, what we're noticing is that when we have a big change in volume, we could shoot all the way up, right? This does not take much pressure, right? This low line didn't even get up that high, so I'm gonna back us out and pick somewhere where we can get to the same volume, right? So let's say here intersects both lines, right? So this highly compliant one for this volume took only a very little bit of pressure. The low compliance line took a lot more. Okay. So this was why we had more volume of blood in our veins. This is why they were holding a lot of volume, but didn't create a lot of pressure, wasn't hard, didn't mess things up, didn't mess up our gradient of high pressure in the arteries, low pressure in the veins. And this is going to be important for our lungs because we want them to expand easy, right? We don't want to have to use much pressure, right? Your intercostal muscles are not that big, right? You don't spend a ton of time working them out, making them super strong. You don't want to have to exert large forces to get your lungs to fully expand. So we're going to want our lungs to be highly compliant. Okay. So when we're thinking about lungs, we can think about their compliance as a measure of how easy it is to expand them, how stretchy they are, almost not stretchy in the bouncing back sense, but like how easy it is to pull them out. Okay. If we wanted to calculate it, we could. I'm going to put some fake numbers in this for you to get the idea. I'm not going to make you calculate this yourself on an exam or something. Okay. But as another way of thinking about this compliance, right? Okay. So what we're doing when we're expanding a lung, right? We're trying to create a volume change, and we have to create a transpulmonary pressure, a difference in pressure, in order to expand that lung, right? So we could measure actually how compliant the lung is, right? And that compliance number would tell us about specifically that relationship between volume changes and pressures, okay? So if we think about it, all right, let's say we just want to use our normal forces, our normal transpulmonary pressure, a normal amount of muscle working, okay? Okay. So our muscles working are creating these changes in our pressures, right? Okay, so for our imaginary numbers, pressure in the intrapleural space is usually like -4. Pressure in the alveoli is bouncing back and forth between -1 and +1, crossing 0 in the middle. So I'm going to give you a 4 as our fakey fake number here on the bottom for our transpulmonary pressure. Okay. Right. Okay. So if we have a lung that has a compliance of, let's just say 1, okay? We're doing some fake numbers, right? So if our lung has a compliance of 1 And we have this pressure difference of 4 for our transpulmonary pressure. We're going to get a volume change of 4. Right? That's how that works. 4 divided by 4 is 1. Okay. But let's think about what happens if this lung becomes more compliant, right? Okay, so we're not going to change how our muscles are acting. So we're not going to change any of these pressures. So we're going to keep that transpulmonary pressure of 4. Well, let's make our lung have higher compliance. So let's say our compliance is now 2, right? So to make both sides of this equation equal, now we've got a bigger volume change, right? Bigger lung, better, more compliant, right? So now using that same force, you expanded your lung a lot more. Right? So if the graph doesn't make sense and equations make more sense to you, think about it this way, right? But either way, what you want to remember is we want our lungs to be compliant. Highly compliant lung means it expands easy. If it's less compliant, it's going to be hard to pull your lungs open, which is not going to be great when we're thinking about how much air can we get into our body for gas exchange. So large lung compliance is good because we don't need to create a very large transpulmonary pressure in order to pull air in. Now, there are things that affect how compliant a lung is, okay? So hopefully you have a highly compliant lung. Hopefully it's not varying, but we do have a trade-off between different physical properties. So like when we talked about arteries and veins, we're thinking about arteries as like a water balloon and a vein as like a big floppy birthday balloon, right? Arteries are very elastic. And when we say elastic, we mean they bounce back hard, right? It's going to require a lot of pressure to put volume into them because they have low compliance, right? So we've got this trade-off between elasticity and compliance. Okay. So since we want our lungs to be highly compliant, we don't want them to be that elastic, okay? Another thing that's going to affect compliance, and this is going to come into play more in lungs, not something that was particularly relevant to the cardiovascular system, is surface tension. Okay. So if our compliance is talking about how easy is it to distend the lung, how easy is it to expand it, one of the things that resist expansion is surface tension, right? So water molecules like to hold on to each other. That exerts a pull. That's part of why we have that negative pressure in the intrapleural space. But we also have some water vapor that you breathe in into your lungs. It's a humid environment in there. Okay. So that does create some surface tension of those water molecules in the alveoli. Okay. So when we have water molecules and surface tension, right, we're going to have an alveolus. Okay. And we'll have some water droplets. Okay. And they're all pulling together, right? They want to become just one big blob, one big droplet, right? So essentially they end up kind of all pulling towards the middle, right? So this is why surface tension is a force that resists expansion, because these water droplets are all pulling towards each other, all pulling towards the middle of the alveolus. And if they were to do that, they would pull the walls of the alveolus closer together and collapse it, okay? So they're pulling on each other, pulling on the alveolus overall, okay? And then we have this thin layer of fluid lining the alveoli, okay? So we have this surface tension attraction between water molecules, but this is why we cared about surfactant, right? So we mentioned that we have type 1 alveolar cells making up the walls of alveoli. Type 2 alveolar cells are making surfactant. So surfactant is going to help us break up this tension, this surface tension. Okay. And we want to do that because if we have a lot of tension in an alveolus, it's going to be less compliant. It's going to expand less well. It's going to make it harder to breathe. Okay. Okay. So we've got our surfactant from those type 2 alveolar cells. We can think of it as kind of a detergent. So it's getting in there between our water molecules. It's breaking them up. They're not neighbors with each other. Water doesn't like detergents like soap, right? They don't mix well together, okay? So this prevents that kind of force of all the water molecules to pull together at the center of the alveolus, okay? So this means that if we have surfactant breaking up tension, right, that tension would have pulled our alveoli closed. So lots of surfactant breaking up the tension means we can expand them easier. Expanding easy means they're more compliant. Okay. So this overall makes it easier to breathe. Okay. So surfactant, really important. Sometimes this can go wrong when babies are born. They need to be producing enough surfactant for their lungs to be working properly. That's one of the things you look at if they're having trouble breathing. We also need to think about the fact when we're thinking about surfactant that not all our alveoli are the same size, okay? So not all the alveoli are the same size, but we have pores between them equalizing pressure because we want a pressure of the alveoli to compare to the pressure of the atmosphere to pull air in and push air out, right? We want to be working as a unit, okay? This creates a little bit of a problem when we think about surface tension and water. We're going to solve the problem with this surfactant, okay? So this is something called, drawn from something called Laplace's law, but we're going to piece it together here, okay? So we have this situation where water molecules pulling together make the alveolus want to collapse, right? But there's a certain pressure inside an alveolus that would resist that, right? Like they start to pull together. You get a really high pressure of air inside the alveolus, it would push out against that and resist it. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at this relationship. So we're looking at pressure, that's a P. Okay. T is our tension. So big tension would be big T. This is our surface tension. Okay. And because we know there's a relationship between pressure and volume, right? Like sizes and pressures have a relationship, right? We also have to factor in size here. So R here is radius. So essentially this is telling us about how big the alveolus is. Okay. All right. So alveoli are different sizes. They're connected to each other. They have pressures that can resist the surface tension that makes them want to collapse, okay? But because pressure and volume have a relationship, pressure and size have a relationship, that pressure that you need inside an alveolus in order to resist any given amount of tension is different, okay? So we can think about like, what are my numbers here? Okay, so let's think about small one or big one first. Let's think about a small alveolus first. Okay, so I'm going to put a bunch of fake numbers in here too. Okay, so we think about this. Let's say we have an alveolus over here with radius 1, all right? And we're going to think about, let's have a tension being 1, 2. We're going to make these examples easy, all right? So to calculate how much pressure we need to resist that tension, let me multiply that by 2, all right? Okay, so here we need a pressure of 2 to resist that surface tension. Okay. But let's pop over to the bigger alveolus. Okay. So if we look at the bigger alveolus, we have the same amount of tension. We still have to multiply it by 2. Let's say it's twice as large. This is bigger. Okay. So in order for this alveolus to resist that tension, we've created a smaller pressure. We don't need so much pressure. Okay. Which is bad because this means there's a pressure gradient, right? So if this was the situation, this was what was actually happening in your body, the air will go from the small alveolus with high pressure to the big alveolus with low pressure. We don't want that to happen because that means all your small alveoli are going to start collapsing. You're not going to have as much surface area for gas exchange. That's no good. Okay. So what we can do is change up how much surfactant we have. So on this other side, we're looking at surfactant. That's these little squiggly guys. That's our detergent. Okay. So that's breaking up water tension by physically interspersing itself. Okay. And you'll notice that this small alveolus has more of it. There's more surfactant in this little one. That's because we're trying to make sure that that alveolus doesn't collapse when we're at equilibrium and everybody's got the same amount of pressure. Okay. So we can think in numbers about what we did here as well, right? So we didn't change the size of the alveolus, and we're thinking about this small one, okay? Right, so its radius is still 1, right? We're still going to have to multiply a tension by 2, right? If we want it to be the same pressure as that larger alveolus, we still want to get eventually to a pressure of 1 so that they're equal. Air isn't moving down a gradient towards the big one. We're going to need to change the tension. Right, so we still need this 2, that's just a constant. But by adding surfactant, we dropped down the surface tension. Okay. I'm not going to make you do this calculation on a test, but this is what's happening in detail from a physical perspective, right? So by adding this surfactant, right, all these little surfactant molecules, we drop down our tension, which means we can now have the same pressure in a big alveolus as in a small alveolus, so your lungs don't start collapsing. So type 2 alveolar cells, important. Surfactant is important to resist the water tension, and we need more of it in our little bitty alveoli. Questions about this concept? Okay, cool. All right, so that's compliance. We want highly compliant lungs. We want them to expand easy. We don't want to have to create a lot of pressure. And in order to make sure that all of our different alveoli are all highly compliant and we're not creating weird pressure differences in order to resist our surface tension, we vary up how much surfactant they have so that everybody is working at the same pressure. Okay, so that's our compliance side. The other thing we need to think about is resistance, right? So if we want air to flow into our lungs, we need them to expand easy, right? We need them to expand easy. We don't want a lot of pressure, but you also need good tubes going to those lungs. Okay. So our airway resistance has the same relationship to size and diameter, and radius as our blood vessels did, right? So small airway, right? Think your throat closing down, big resistance, hard to breathe in. Big airway, big tube, easy peasy, easy to pull air in. You're nice and relaxed. Okay. So we have our airways splitting. We've gone through our upper airways. We went into the pharynx. We went through the larynx into the trachea. We split into our primary bronchi going to each lung. Then we have secondary bronchi going to each of the lobes of the lung. And then we have tertiary bronchi going to segments. We keep splitting, we keep splitting. We become bronchioles. Bronchioles get smaller. The end of the conducting zone, we're calling them terminary bronchioles. They've lost their cartilage, but they are not doing gas exchange yet. We get to the respiratory zone. Now we have respiratory bronchioles, and we're heading into alveolar sacs with alveoli. And across that respiratory zone, we have actual gas exchange happening. Yeah. So all of those airways, all of those tubes have a size. All of them have a radius. All of them have a diameter. Okay. Overall, our resistance is pretty low. Overall, it's pretty easy to breathe. Overall, we don't have lots of forces, lots of friction resisting the flow of air, which is great. Even though after all those splits, individual little tiny bronchioles would be smaller. We have tons of them. So across the lung as a whole, we still have low resistance, okay? So we got big tubes in your throat, and then we've got lots of tubes in your lungs. Overall, low resistance. Okay. This is good because in order to create airflow, we need a pressure gradient, but we don't want to work that hard. And so in order to not work that hard, we make those airways low in their resistance, right? So this is just that flow rule again, right? We want stuff to flow. We need a pressure difference, which we know we're using our muscles to pull on our chest, to pull on our intrapleural fluid, to create a transpulmonary pressure, to create an alveolar pressure. I feel like I'm singing the little old woman who swallowed the fly. But overall, we need a pressure difference. We created a pressure difference between the atmosphere and inside your lungs. We would have to divide it by the resistance. But if we have a low resistance, we don't need to have much of a pressure difference. It's going to be easy to get flow. So normally, our pressure gradient, we don't need to create that big one because we don't have that much resistance. So on the order about a millimeter of mercury for our pressure. Yep. If we increase resistance though, right, if that number on the bottom gets bigger, right, if we increase resistance, but we still want airflow, we still want air going into our lungs, we're going to need to create a bigger pressure difference, which means we're going to have to work our muscles harder, right? We're going to have to work harder to breathe. There is going to be a limit to how big you can make your thorax and therefore how big a pressure gradient you could create ever. So more resistance, bad, right? Less compliant is bad, more resistance is bad. So here you can see this in graph form, right? So this is showing us what it would take to create a specific amount of breath, right? So this is just the volume of air moving in and out of the lungs. That's not changing for these two lines, right? We can see our normal line for alveolar pressures. So this is our alveolar pressure inside the lung, right? Normally, when you breathe in, dips down to -1. Air comes in, reaches equilibrium with the atmosphere. Then you start to breathe out by creating a high pressure in the lung. It comes to a maximum, and we drop back down. Okay. So that's our normal breath. But if we have a big resistance, right? So if we're thinking about this high resistance situation, right? So say your airways are full of mucus or your airways are spasming and constricting down, making it hard to breathe. This is why it's hard to breathe, right? You got a high resistance situation. So now we need a big pressure difference. And since we set atmospheric pressure equal to 0, what that really means is we need this alveolar pressure to be dropping down a lot more, right? So this increased resistance, right? Now we needed to go to -2 in order to get that same amount of air into the lung. And to force it out, we also need a bigger pressure difference because we've got these skinny little constricted tubes. So we're going to need to create a higher pressure and therefore a higher pressure difference to force all that air out of the lungs. So if you increase your resistance, you make it harder to breathe, harder to move air. So we're going to have factors that affect airway resistance. Some of them are going to be normal, right? So we have normal changes during the respiratory cycle. So we have a normal transpulmonary pressure happening. We are changing how big your airways and how big your lungs are during these passive normal breaths. We're expanding airways, specifically when you breathe in. We'll talk about how smooth muscle and mucus and different neurotransmitters and hormones, et cetera, affect the situation next time. Oh, and also because of the quiz issue over last weekend, I made sure that the quiz should be popping up for you tomorrow. So if people can't see it by Friday in class, please someone tell me.